So welcome to the folks that are here in the room with me, and welcome to you at home. I am Kate Cutco. I am sorry, I'm also admitting people out of the waiting room. Let me know if you see some other folks, okay?
Did you get Ann?
I got Ann.
Okay.
So welcome. We are pleased to be here tonight live. We're recording this. If anybody has objections to that, I will post it until after you have a discussion with me about how we can do that in a respectful way. I am Kate Cutco. I'm the director of the Bowdoinham Public Library, and we are sponsoring tonight's program along with the Committee on Age-Friendly Bowdoinham. And thank you very, very much for the support that they offered. The folks at home on Zoom really don't need to know about the 4 dozen fresh baked cookies that are over there on the table. Sorry. But that's the price you pay. The price you pay for the comfort of staying home tonight. Ann's all set.
And Gracious too.
Gracious all set. Okay, so I am going to introduce our speaker tonight, and then I'll switch her over to the spotlight view. Valerie Lovelace is the executive director of Maine's Death with Dignity. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. Prior to being the director of that organization, its precursor, she was the founder and director of the precursor to that organization, which was called It's My Death, which was founded in 2014. Valerie was the driving force behind the historic effort, which took 3 legislative sessions and finally to be ushered into law, the Death with Dignity Act in 2019. I'm probably naming it wrong, but Valerie's going to correct me, I'm sure. Valerie is an interfaith chaplain and a retired Navy veteran, and she's a mom and a grandmother. We are welcoming Valerie to speak with us. It's part of the mission of the Maine's Death with Dignity organization. Its mission being to provide services, education, and end-of-life advocacy to people who wish to actively explore the meaning of life through embracing the certainty of death. And so what we're doing here tonight is central to their mission, which is to connect people with the information that they need to make fully informed decisions regarding their end-of-life care options and to support patients and providers through the process as needed. Thank you, Valerie. Valerie's going to speak to us for about 40 minutes. We won't interrupt her talk to take questions. We will take questions at the end of that 40-minute period, 40 to 45, we think. If someone is not comfortable putting their question, I am recording tonight. If someone isn't comfortable speaking their question from Zoom, I ask that you put it direct message to me in the chat and I will ask it anonymously. Hope that works for everybody. And Valerie, let's give you the spotlight.
And check your wait.
Oh, and here in the room we have a bucket for donations to either the library or Death of Dignity. So if any of you want to do that from the comfort of your own home, I'll set you up with a link.
She has a
Pin. Welcome, Valerie.
Thanks very much, Kate. I appreciate it. And I appreciate that everyone is here this evening to learn a little bit about the Maine Death with Dignity Act. I'm going to put up my screen share shortly. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. The first thing is I live in rural Maine, as I know most of you do, and sometimes I have hiccups in my internet. So if the screen should happen to freeze up or I should happen to disappear, please sit tight. I'll be right back. It usually doesn't take more than 30 to 45 seconds if I do get a hiccup, but hopefully that will not happen tonight. As Kate mentioned, Kate, I'm going to go ahead and mute your
We're having a
unit
little
there
trouble
too.
hearing.
Okay? So I find it's much easier for folks to stay on mute during the presentation. If you happen to have some note taking, paper, pen, or whatever, jot down things as they occur to you, because we'll have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A, and I'm really happy to stay on as long as folks have questions. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. And if somebody could just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing those slides, awesome. We'll go ahead and get started. So tonight we're going to talk about the term death with dignity in the context of United States legal and medical practice, and we'll clarify the circumstances under which most people access these laws in the United States. We'll talk about the terminology, and I want to clarify the terminology that's used in relation to death with dignity laws. As you may see some of these terms in the media, you may hear them from other people, and I just want to bring some clarity to those terms and why some of them are appropriate and some of them are not appropriate. And then we'll talk about the legal and medical requirements for patient qualification in the United States and specifically in Maine. So first, I want to talk about the legal definition of assisted dying or death with dignity in the United States. And that is the legal prescribing of a single dose of medication that a qualified patient will self-ingest. And all of the underlined areas on this slide have some specific legal background that I'll be talking about. So the medication comes in a lethal quantity. It's written by a consenting physician, meaning the physicians don't have to practice aid in dying. They can practice aid in dying if they choose to do that, or if their employer permits them to do that. The prescription would come at the formal request of a qualified terminally ill patient, and I'll define this evening what that means to be qualified. And it follows a legally defined standard of care process in that state. So the only exception to that is the state of Montana. There was a challenge in 2008-2009 brought against the state of Montana by a gentleman who had terminal lung cancer with his physicians. And what they asserted to the state was there was a constitutional right in the state of Montana, based on the state's constitution, that a patient could have private conversations with their physician, and that a physician could practice medicine at the end of life as they saw fit. That case went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court did not agree that the Montana Constitution permitted that. But what they did say is there are no statutes on the books in Montana that would prohibit the practice of medical aid in dying. And so with that, the practice of medical aid in dying became available without statute in the state of Montana. What's challenging for Montanans, of course, is because there's really nothing on the books, so to speak. A lot of patients don't know it's available to them. A lot of physicians are unaware that they can practice it. And every legislative session since that lawsuit, someone in the legislature has brought forward a bill attempting to outlaw medical aid in dying in Montana. So far, fortunately, they have failed to be able to do that. And, I'm hoping at some point they just give up trying to outlaw it. But so for now, Montana has medical aid in dying, but just not a statute on the books. And therefore, they don't have a specific legally defined standard of care for it. Now I want to talk about the medical definition, because it really is very different than the legalese that you would find in a law. It's a medical practice that involves clinician evaluation and care for a terminally ill patient who considers and potentially follows through with hastening their imminent death through the use of medications prescribed for that purpose. This definition comes from Lonnie Shavelson. He's a doctor out in California. He is the founder of the American Clinicians Academy on Medical Aid in Dying. The Academy currently has, I would say, I think it's around 900 clinicians and other professionals who are on the listserv now. And the goal of the Academy is to formalize and standardize the standards of care for medical aid in dying in the United States, so that no matter what state you're in, if your state permits that practice, you're practicing using best practices, you're practicing with the known process, you're practicing with the right kinds of medication, you're getting the training that you need, and so forth. So the practice of medical aid in dying from a physician's perspective is not just about qualifying the patient and writing a prescription and then they're done. It's ongoing care, it's palliative support for a patient with a terminal disease who wants to augment other end-of-life care, such as hospice or other palliative comfort care, with the potential to hasten their death as a means of controlling their own circumstances at the end of life. Currently, aid in dying is available in 11 U.S. jurisdictions. That's 10 states and Washington, D.C. What that means is that in 40 states, physicians are still prohibited this palliative care practice. And all U.S. territories and possessions are also still prohibited. It was started in 1994 in the pioneering state of Oregon. There were other states attempting to pass legislation at the time. Maine was one of those. I think our first bill was in 1992 or 1993. But Oregon had a citizens initiative which passed, and their law was going to go into effect in 1994, except the federal government decided to intervene and tell the state of Oregon, you can't practice medicine that way. So their law sort of went into limbo while they had the legal battle in the courts. And 3 years later, the federal government lost that argument. Lawmakers in Oregon put the issue back to ballot, and Oregonians passed it by an even greater margin. That was followed almost 11 years later by a citizens initiative called I-1000 in the state of Washington that passed and went into effect in 2008. And that was followed very quickly by the lawsuit in Montana. And then for the first time ever, a state actually passed legislation via the House and the Senate rather than a citizens initiative, and that was the state of Vermont. Following a 10-year campaign, their Act 39 went into effect in 2013. California followed very quickly on the heels of that, also by legislative action in 2015. Colorado had a citizens initiative which passed by 67% of the voters, and that went into effect in 2016. Washington, D.C. followed very quickly with a city council vote in 2017 and passed their law for the citizens of the residents of Washington, D.C. The challenge that Washington, D.C. faces in their implementation, there's actually two challenges. The first challenge is that they are not a state, so they have federal government oversight, including the setting of their budget and supporting any programs that are operating in Washington, D.C. So that makes it a little dicey for Washington, D.C. because the federal government is still trying to interfere with these laws and will try to cut their budget and try to outlaw medical aid in dying in Washington, D.C. using writers on bills and so forth. But so far they have been able to maintain that autonomy. There's at least one physician I know of practicing in Washington, D.C. The other challenge they face, of course, is because Washington, D.C. is a very small place. And they are surrounded by two pretty large states where a lot of people get their health care. So if you reside in DC, but you get your health care over in Virginia or Maryland, you're not likely to be able to access medical aid in dying unless you can find a physician who works and resides in Washington, DC to help you qualify. So that's a little bit of a challenge. It's also a challenge if you happen to live in DC and you get your health care there, or from physicians in Maryland or Virginia, but they can't practice medicine across state lines when it comes to aid in dying. So even if you've got a multi-state or multi-jurisdiction licensed physician, if they are not standing in Washington, D.C., even if they can practice in Washington, D.C., they can't support you as a resident there. Hawaii came online a year later, also by legislative action in 2018, and then for the first time, 2 states passed in the same year. That was Maine and New Jersey in 2019. And then New Mexico came online in 2021. Theirs was also a 25-year history of on-again, off-again attempts to pass legislation. Right now, there are, I believe there were over 20 bills introduced in legislatures across the United States. There are still several of them active and doing very well. The New Hampshire bill just passed the House vote by 2 votes, and it goes to a Senate floor debate, I believe, next week or the following week. Massachusetts bill is still alive. I think the New York bill may still be alive. Minnesota's bill has actually passed 2 committees with recommendations to pass. And so this year really seems to be a year that many states that have been trying for a long time are actually getting some traction. You'll also see on this slide, there's some red arrows there with some dates. And I believe these events have been like catalysts in having public conversations about the way we die. Some of you may remember a doctor in the state of Michigan. His name was Jack Kevorkian. In 1999, he was convicted of actively participating in the death of one of his patients. Prior to that time, he had been devising the means by which his patients could administer medication to themselves to hasten their death, but he was not actively participating until 1999. When he did that, he crossed a huge legal line and an ethical line, because there's a massive difference between a person taking their own medication and someone giving them the medication via injection or any other means. It's one thing to take your own medication with the cognitive ability to do that. It's an entirely different thing when someone administers that medication to you. So Dr. Kevorkian went to jail for that. What I do credit him with, though, is having the courage to have public conversations and to be in the forefront of those conversations about the ways we die, the ways we get chronically sick in this country, and how people should have a right to control their circumstances. So we fast forward to 2014. There was a young woman in the state of California. She was 29 years old. Her name was Brittany Menard. She found out shortly after her honeymoon that she had a glioblastoma brain tumor. California, her state of residence, had just failed to pass a citizens initiative in 2013. And she spoke with her husband and her mother and said, I want to move to Oregon. I want to become a resident there, get my health care there, and eventually I want to use the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. Her husband and her mother agreed. They packed up hearth and home and moved Brittany to Oregon. She lived out the remainder of her life there. And on November 1st of 2014, she ended her life with medical aid in dying under the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. That event, prior to Brittany's death, she recorded about a 6-minute video, which you can find on YouTube. If you were to go on YouTube and just look for Brittany Menard, M-A-Y-N-E-R-D, you will find that video. There's probably over 12 million views on it now. That was actually a catalyst that, again, put this conversation really in our living rooms and on our kitchen tables. First of all, people were hearing from a very young, very healthy, vital person who suddenly was terminally ill with a brain tumor, and talking about why it was important to her to be able to move to Oregon with her mom and her husband, what it meant to them as a family to be able to support her, and why medical aid in dying was so important. Lawmakers in California listened. Brittany's mother and husband were really strong advocates in California, and the legislature finally took up the issue and passed that law in 2015. Brittany's husband and mom are still very staunch advocates of medical aid in dying, that it should be available for people with terminal illness who want to control their circumstances. In fact, Brittany's husband travels all over the country educating lawmakers, educating patients and families, and educating healthcare providers by sharing their story. And then we fast forward to 2020. And of course, at the very beginning of 2020, this massive pandemic breaks out across the globe. Um, People were trying to get a grip on what was happening, and we went into lockdown and isolation. And suddenly, the world as we knew it became a very different and potentially hostile place because of how contagious COVID was. A few things happened, and the first thing I want to say is a person with COVID, as they are preparing to go on a ventilator, would not have time to qualify for the Maine Death with Dignity Act. But I do believe the pandemic is another catalyst to help us really begin to talk about things like, the end of our life if we're on a ventilator, or, for the first time in our lived history, we were seeing hospitals run out of room for sick patients. We were seeing funeral homes run out of room for cadavers. There were hospital trucks in the streets of New York because there was not enough space inside of a funeral home to manage all of the death that was occurring in the early stages of COVID. We saw healthcare providers dropping in their socks in hospitals, succumbing to the very disease they were trying to help people survive. So, and globally, I think we are going to feel the impact of this kind of death and loss and grief for decades to come. Over 1 million people have died with COVID-related illness in this country alone. And I think, it's another opportunity for us to recognize our mortality, recognize how fragile human life can be at times, and to make plans for those things. When COVID hit, it occurred to me that I had written my advance directive and didn't put any pandemic plans in there. It never occurred to me we might experience a pandemic in my lifetime. So I redid my advance directive, and I got my son and daughter-in-law on the phone, and I talked through what it meant to be on a ventilator and what happens in an ER and what my wishes were around that. So again, COVID, I think, has been a huge, huge force in waking us up to the ideas that, we need to really take responsibility for our mortality and put together plans and have conversations with our family and our providers and our clergy people and whoever else is important in your life. Because at any moment, we could be breathing our last moment. So I like to show this slide from Oregon's annual report. The folks who got the law passed in Oregon had the foresight to require the state to publish demographic information every year on who was using the law in terms of, age bracket, income bracket, and so forth. This slide shows the numbers of people who are written a prescription, which is that blue line, and the numbers of deaths that occurred by taking that prescription. That's the red line. And what you can see is since 1998, it's pretty consistent that it's about 30%, 35% of the folks who receive a prescription don't use it, and the other 65% of the folks do use that medication. There's a lot of reasons for it. For some, they find that they don't actually feel like they need to use it. For others, they may wait too long, and then they don't have the physical strength to take that medication on their own. I've heard from some patients, and I can't even imagine what it's like to try to choose the day you're going to use your medication. But some folks wait and wait and wait, and then by the time they want to choose it, they've passed that window where they can actually take that medication on their own. And then in some states, folks die, they qualify for the prescription, but they die before they can take it, get it from the pharmacy and take it. So they die during a waiting period. But overall, and our data in Maine, we only have 4 years to show, but our data in Maine is very consistent with this. About 2/3 of the folks who get a prescription actually do use it. What we know from Oregon's long history is that about half of the folks who access medical aid in dying are male and the other half are female. And as you might guess, most of the folks are over the age of 45. because that's when we start getting more chronically ill and we end up with diseases like cancer and ALS and things like that. There are some younger folks, in that first age bracket, 18 to 34. That's where Brittany's number is. But for the most part, it's folks age 45. And you can see as those age brackets increase, those numbers also increase. What I find interesting about the Oregon data is it shows that over the past I think it's now 27 years, 26 years, 96% of the folks who access medical aid in dying are Caucasian and have higher education. What's unusual about that is that the overall demographics of the state of Oregon is only 74% Caucasian. So all things being equal, we should be seeing about 74% Caucasian accessing medical aid and dying, and then other percentages involving people of color. And we don't see that, and we haven't seen that. There's a lot of conjecture over why that is. Personally, I think it's because of the federal funding ban. You actually cannot use Medicare to access medical aid in dying. And I think this kind of speaks to things that we learned during COVID, where it became very obvious that access to high quality healthcare is a pretty privileged thing in this country, and that not everybody has equal access to healthcare. But as hard as it is to study something that is happening, it's even harder to study something that isn't happening. So as you can imagine, it would be really tough to go out and find terminally ill non-whites who were willing to participate in a study while they're terminally ill, who would be willing to talk about why they're not accessing the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon. So I don't know that we'll ever really know the answer to this, but there's all kinds of circumstantial evidence that sort of suggests that if you don't have resources, you are not going to be able to access medical aid in dying. Not in the United States. And that's unique to the United States, that that we have to pay out of pocket because we cannot use Medicare. Other characteristics that we've learned from Oregon is that over 90% of the folks who access medical aid in dying are also enrolled in and receiving hospice care at the time of their death. This is really important because early on, what they found in Oregon and what they included in their law is that patients weren't really being told about their condition. If they were being told about their condition, they weren't being told about all their options. So the Oregon law, and Maine's law, in fact, requires physicians to tell a patient about their healthcare condition, about their healthcare options, about all options that are available to them, including any treatments, any disease-directed type of care, any pain or comfort care, and the medical aid in dying option that's available here in Maine. Physicians are required to have that conversation. Over the years in Oregon, that drove Oregon to become really a gold standard state when it comes to delivery of hospice care, even in the most rural parts of their state. They have excellent care and excellent delivery of care across the state of Oregon. I am actually friends with the individual who was the executive director of the Oregon Hospice Council back when their law went into effect. She originally opposed the law, and then of course once it passed, she had to help implement it and make sure that the hospice organizations in Oregon were trained to understand it. And what she saw over the years changed her mind not only about the law, but changed her mind about how to make sure they were delivering high quality hospice care to all four corners of that state. It used to be back in the day that a lot of folks had private insurance, and you see those numbers now are really starting to change, decreasing, from this 44% range now to 21% and then 20%. And it's typical that fewer people now have private insurance as they end up getting that sick. And many people who are trying to access medical aid in dying are already on Medicare, age 65 and older. The challenge with that, of course, is that the federal government, back when they lost the legal battle with the state of Oregon, they said, okay, Oregon, you can have your law, but you're never going to use federal money to support it. So a bunch of lawmakers got together and they passed the 1997 federal funding ban on assisted suicide. That's what the name of the ban is called. And they prohibited the use of Medicare, Medicaid, or any other federally funded care from use. They also prohibited any federal employee, such as a physician at the VA healthcare center, as an example. All federally funded employees are prohibited from practicing. No federally funded clinic or hospital system can participate. So what I can tell you is that as a veteran of 20 years, that really fries my potatoes, that my primary care physician up at Togus, even if she supports my decision when I'm terminally ill, she cannot write me a referral to a civilian doctor out in town because of the federal funding ban. It means for all of us hardworking Americans who have contributed the whole of our working lives to Medicare, it means we cannot use our own Medicare funds for medical aid in dying at the end of our life. So if that bothers you as much as it bothers me, please go to our website, maindeathwithdignity.org. There is a button there for taking action. If you take action, you can select that you want to write your lawmakers to repeal the federal funding ban. It's a very quick process. You just fill out your name. It will send your letter right directly to all of your Washington, D.C. representatives. Because I think if we don't start making noise about this, we're never going to get any movement on trying to get that law changed. And frankly, I think it should be changed. Personally, I believe every dying person should have everything available to them that they need while they're dying, and that includes the use of your Medicare funds. In terms of the ways people are dying, by far and away, most of the folks who access medical aid in dying have cancer, and that's followed by a pretty large population of overall 11% of folks who have neurological diseases, such as ALS, Parkinson's, MS, and brain tumors. And then there's a whole lot of other smaller causes of death, but primarily it's cancer and neurological diseases. What's challenging for people with neurological diseases is if that disease begins to affect your capacity for decision making, you cannot qualify for medical aid in dying. So that's something to keep in mind. This is about the point where most people go, wait a minute, what about dementia? And the sad fact is, here in the United States, people with dementia cannot access medical aid in dying. And I'll talk about the details of why that is. So let's talk very briefly about terminology, and then we'll get into the qualification requirements. The original term that was coined back in 1992 or 93, when all of this really began, was death with dignity. It's the name of Oregon's law, the Death with Dignity Act. Washington's law is also the Death with Dignity Act. Ours is called the Maine Death with Dignity Act. Washington, D.C.'s is also the Death with Dignity Act. The reason I prefer this term is simply because when I use this term, people go, oh, that's that law in Oregon. Don't we have that here in Maine too? So it's recognizable. There are some people who disagree with the use of this term. They argue that it implies that unless you're using medical aid in dying, you can't have a dignified death. I don't think it implies that at all, but some people feel that way. Other appropriate terms are aid in dying, medical assistance or aid in dying, or the acronym MAID, which I don't really like, but and physician aid in dying, PAD. These terms can be used interchangeably. I often use them interchangeably, but mostly I use death with dignity or aid in dying. Medical assistance or aid in dying is the term that other countries use for their laws, and their laws are more progressive than ours are. And that term, physician aid in dying or medical assistance in dying, sort of implies that a physician is much more involved than just assessing a patient, writing a prescription, and following their care until they take that prescription. All the other countries permit physicians to administer medication to a patient. That's active euthanasia. We are not permitted to do that in the United States for human beings. But like in Canada, as an example, they have an option where you can either take the medication yourself or you can ask your physician to do it for you. and 99.9999% of the people in Canada choose to have their physician come to their home and administer the medication through an IV. Inappropriate terms are suicide, assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, mercy killing, so forth. These terms were also coined back in the beginning. They are the preferred terms for institutional opposition. Some media outlets still use these terms, but generally speaking, if these terms are in use, you can tie that back to some sort of institutional opposition. As an example, we had an individual, a senator here in Maine, who testified against the bill, and during her 3.5-minute speech, she used the term assisted suicide or suicide 16 times. These terms are used to create fear and doubt and a smokescreen, and to confuse the issue and try to get people to either not support the laws or to misunderstand what the laws actually permit. Again, euthanasia is not illegal here in the United States for human beings. During the time that California was working on their bill in 2014, 2015, there was a religious news outlet that their news anchor was announcing the progress of the bill in Oregon or in California. And while she was doing that, an image came up behind her on the screen of a syringe with a blue fluid in it, which is misleading as all get out, because the use of a syringe is not legal in the United States for medical aid in dying. So if you're out there hearing these terms, in all likelihood, you're hearing them from someone who really doesn't understand what the laws are about, or you're hearing it from someone who has a moral objection or institutional objection to medical aid in dying. Maine's law, these are actual excerpts from the law that, and Maine's law speaks to this, as does every other state law, has language very similar to this. Our law first states that this act does not authorize a physician or any other person to end a patient's life by lethal injection, mercy killing, or active euthanasia. Right there in plain black and white, it says you can't do that. There are statutes in the criminal code that would cover it. If you did these things, you would be outside of the context of the Maine Death with Dignity Act, and therefore not protected by law. If you did these things, you'd find yourself in some pretty hot water, like Dr. Kevorkian did. Our law goes on to state that actions taken in accordance with this act do not for any purpose constitute a suicide, assisted suicide, mercy killing, or homicide under the law. There's very pragmatic reasons for this. The first is that when a patient dies, their physician cannot put the term suicide or assisted suicide on their death certificate. They also can't write that they use the Maine Death with Dignity Act as an example, because that would be disclosure of a healthcare decision of a patient, and that's protected by HIPAA. There's also, there are laws on Maine's books that would go into effect if any of these types of death were happening. So, law enforcement might need to be notified. Clinicians would have to do mandated reporting, and they might have to activate an intervention and so forth. None of those circumstances apply with an aid in dying death. An aid in dying death is considered a medically supervised death. It has an attending physician who is overseeing the process, and therefore this language sort of takes it out of the context of those other statutes. State reports may not refer to acts committed under this act as a suicide or assisted suicide. So when the state publishes suicide statistics, they cannot include these numbers. There is a hospice organization that continues to do that, include medical aid in dying as a suicide number. Unfortunately, not everybody in hospice agrees that a patient has a right to do this, and so we still fight misinformation in the state. Even our state statistic report that comes out every year, they cannot, even if they disagree with the law, whoever's publishing that report, they cannot use the words suicide or assisted suicide. The law goes on to state that nothing contained in this act may be interpreted to lower the applicable standard of care for an attending physician, consulting physician, psychiatrist, psychologist, or other healthcare provider providing services under this act. What this statement means in plain language is, if, let's say, you've just been given a terminal diagnosis and you're talking with your therapist about that, and you let your therapist know that you're interested in qualifying for the Maine Death with Dignity Act, and you're going to be talking to your physician about that. Your therapist can't then abandon your care. They cannot enact, mandated reporting. They can't do any of those things that they might do if they had a patient who were saying they were going to end their life who wasn't terminally ill. It also means if you're, let's say, you're in a Catholic hospital and you indicate to your physician that you want to use Maine's Death with Dignity Act, they can't abandon your care. So they can't do things like say, oh, well, if you're going to do that, then I'm not going to enter your name and your case in this experimental treatment program to see if we can get that for you. They are not allowed to lower the standard of care for your health simply because you have expressed an interest in using the Maine Death with Dignity Act. So statements like these in our law protect you as a patient, they protect your family, they protect your physician and other healthcare providers, which is really important to do. So in the simplest of terms, the law does two things. The first thing is it codifies the process and medical standard of care by defining who can access it and under exactly what circumstances. What's unique about that is there are no other laws that I'm aware of that direct physicians how to practice medicine. So we don't have laws that tell an oncologist how to deliver chemotherapy. We don't have laws that tell a surgeon how to take out your appendix. But these laws are very specific for physicians with what the requirements are so that they can remain inside the standard of care and have visibility to that. So there's a laundry list of things in the law. If you were to go read all, I think it's 13 pages, you can find the actual text of the law on our website or on the Maine Legislature website. You would see exactly what a physician needs, right down to what they have to write in your medical record, what they have to say to you, and so forth. It's quite specific, the things that they have to go through to help qualify their patients. And then it distinguishes or insulates this kind of a death from those other kinds of deaths that are defined in other statutes in criminal code. So it's an expected death that does not require any policy, procedural, or emergency responses. And it's also the mechanism by which a patient's life insurance policy would be protected from non-payment if an insurance company wanted to, try to say, wait a minute, your loved one ended their life with this medication, we're not paying on that policy. They can't do that because in the law, it says it's not a suicide. I actually got to meet the attorney who was the lead author on the original Oregon law, and I don't think he really understands how elegant and how simple the law is. So Maine's law is 13 pages long. If you were to live in, say, Australia, you lived in Tasmania as an example, Tasmania's law is 180 pages long. It's a very complicated process to qualify for aid in dying there. And once you get qualified, you actually have to submit to the state to get a written permit to do it. Frankly, I don't know how people live long enough to get through a process like that. So our laws are pretty straightforward. They leave a lot of discretion to the physician and the patient, except for the codified standard of care piece that they actually have to follow to the letter. So what does it mean to qualify in Maine? And this is pretty true of most states. In every state, the patient has to be an adult. Here in Maine, that's defined as somebody who is 18 years of age or older. You have to be a resident of Maine. Section 15 of the law has a whole laundry list of things you can produce for your physician to establish that you are a resident of Maine. And I'll come back to these three little asterisks in a minute. You have to be diagnosed with a terminal disease and have a 6-month or less prognosis medically confirmed by 2 physicians. So this is at the time you want to begin qualifying, you must already have the terminal disease 6-month prognosis. you also must have capacity to make an informed decision. And this is where it's hard for people to understand about dementia. By the time you are terminal with dementia and you are within 6 months of your death, you don't have capacity to make an informed decision. And that's what stops a dementia patient from having access to medical aid and dying, because it requires the terminal diagnosis, prognosis, and capacity in order to begin the qualification process. If your physician, either of your physicians, are concerned about your capacity for decision making, they have to, by law, refer you to a qualified mental health professional to assess the situation and determine whether you do in fact have capacity, or if there's something going on that can be remediated. So some folks, may have effects of medication. They may be dehydrated, and that can be affecting their decision-making ability. If your situation can be corrected, you can go back to your physician to begin qualifying. But if you're losing capacity and that appears to be a permanent problem that's affecting your decision-making ability, then your qualification process would stop. So most physicians have training that will help them to determine whether a patient is awake, aware, alert, and oriented to their surroundings. So like when you go see your doctor for a follow-up appointment, or you're there for your annual physical, when they're asking you, how the summer vacation went, or how your kids are, or what the grandkids are up to, they're actually also doing a capacity assessment while they're talking to you, to determine if you are awake, aware, alert, and oriented to your surroundings. And if they had those kinds of concerns, then of course you would be getting a referral somewhere. And that's the same for medical aid in dying. The additional piece is that you have to have the body strength to ingest the medication. So in other countries, as I mentioned, they not only have access for their physician to administer the medication, but they have access for injection or IV administration. We don't have those things here in the United States. We can only take the medicine through our digestive system. So medically, there are 3 routes to the digestive system. The first, of course, is by mouth, if you have the ability to swallow. Some people with cancers of the mouth, or ALS, sometimes Parkinson's, have trouble swallowing. If there's anything that interferes with your swallowing, in all likelihood, you would have a feeding tube installed. So you can administer your medication through your feeding tube. If you don't have the ability to use your mouth and you don't have a feeding tube, you can administer your own medication through a rectal catheter. That is a pretty rare situation. Most folks who lose the ability to use their mouth end up with a feeding tube. But in those rare instances, there have been people who administer their medication through a rectal catheter. With the feeding tube and the catheter, the patient themselves has to push the plunger on the syringe that holds the medication. So it's still, you have to have enough strength in your body to do that. There was a legal challenge in the state of California brought by a woman with ALS who had lost so much upper body strength, she didn't have the strength to push the plunger. And that went all the way to the California State Supreme Court. She asserted that the law in California was a violation of the American Disabilities Act and a violation of the California Disabilities Act. And the state Supreme Court disagreed with her. What the Disabilities Act requires is that reasonable accommodations be made for individuals who have disabilities in any setting. So what the court felt was that the requirement to self-ingest already was the reasonable accommodation in a medical aid in dying law, and that because of the need for safeguards, if you don't have the ability to self-ingest, that leaves you in a position of not being able to qualify. So as of right now, here in the United States, self-ingestion is still the method of medication delivery. And until, I don't see that changing anytime soon, I don't think. But until that changes, there will be no opportunity for an individual who needs help taking the medication, or who would want someone to make that decision for them if they couldn't make a decision for themselves. I don't see that in our future anytime soon. Having said all of that, I highly recommend that folks have a conversation with their physician, which you can do at any time, particularly if you think there's even a remote possibility that at some time at the end of your life, you might want to have this prescription ready if you feel like you need it. I've had folks tell me, I talked to my physician and I really didn't get a straight answer. And I'll say, what exactly did you say to your physician? And they'll tell me, well, I asked him how he felt about the Maine Death with Dignity Act. So I would encourage you not to ask a question like that. That's a pretty broad question and it could get almost any answer. For me, what I really want to know is my physician the guy or gal I can count on who will help me qualify at the end of my life, follow my care, write my prescription, and be at my bedside when I want to take that medication? Do I have that doctor? If your doctor says, yes, I will be that guy or gal, you can count on me, I will support your decision. My next question of my doctor would be, how many people have you done this for already? Because if the answer is 0, then can I really rely on them? It's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to actually be in practice. So while you are making your end of life plans, I would recommend that you have this conversation with your physician just to get a feel for how well supported you would be. So the process starts with the terminal diagnosis, 6-month prognosis, capacity to make healthcare decisions. So let's say you're with your doctor and they say, gosh, Val, I'm really sorry. We've done a lot of care for you and you're now in a condition that you're terminal and there's really not much more we can do at this point. And I'd like to talk to you about your end of life options, talk to you about hospice, so forth. That would be the time I should say, Doc, you've just given me a whole lot of bad news and I have a lot to think about. I want to talk about all those things with you, any kind of treatment options that might be available, any kind of palliative care, hospice care, comfort care that's available to me. And I want you to know right now, I want to qualify for the Maine Death with Dignity Act. If I should ever need that, I want to do that now. That would count as my first verbal request. That should be documented in my medical record. It technically should be documented in your medical record, even if your physician says, I'm sorry, that's not something I practice. They should still be willing to document that in your medical record. But let's go forward, assuming that I do have that physician who will do that. Then that physician is going to go through that standard of care process. They're going to talk about all the things I need to be considering. They're going to let me know that I have to wait 15 days. That gives them time, my two physicians, to get together. They have to agree on my health care condition. They have to agree on my prognosis, and they have to agree that I have capacity to make decisions like that. I also then will go home and use this time to talk with my family, talk with the people who are important to me, to let them know this is really what I want. I'm going to qualify for this. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to use the medication, but I want the option available to me. So after that 15-day waiting period, you're going to have a conversation again with your attending physician. And at that point, you will be submitting a written request that has to be signed by 2 witnesses. Only one of your witnesses can be related to you by blood, marriage, or adoption. That second witness has to be a disinterested person. So what a disinterested person is somebody who's not going to benefit in any way from your death. So let's say you have a terrific next door neighbor and they have been wonderful for all the years you guys have lived next door, and you want to leave them your Volkswagen. That's great if you're leaving them your Volkswagen, but they cannot then sign your written request because they will be benefiting from your death. If you're not leaving your next door neighbor your Volkswagen and you happen to get along with your next door neighbor, they could be that disinterested witness. It could be your best friend. It could be your family attorney. It could be your mailman. It just cannot be somebody related to you, and they cannot be benefiting in any way from your death. What these witnesses are actually doing when they watch you sign the written request and then they will sign it, they are attesting to the fact that they watched you sign it and it didn't appear to them that anybody forced you to sign it. and that as you signed it, it appeared to them that you knew what you were signing. So they don't have to be mental health specialists. All they have to do is by their signature say, it looks to me like this individual knows what they're signing and they weren't forced to sign it. So once you have all of that turned in to the physician and the two physicians agree on your condition and prognosis, they can then agree to write your prescription. Generally, the physician will recommend to you that you not pick it up from the pharmacy. They'll transmit it to the pharmacy, but they recommend that you hold it there until you're feeling close to being ready to use it. They also, by the way, have a 48-hour waiting period after that 15-day waiting period. So let's say, you forget your written request at home, or the dog ate it, or you spilled coffee on it, or whatever, and you need to get another written request to them, and you don't do that for another week. There's still an additional 48-hour waiting period before the prescription can be written. So just be aware of that 15 days can extend out pretty quickly if everything's not taken care of. So, but let's assume everything's taken care of, and you've got the prescription at a pharmacy. This is a prescription that has to be filled by a compounding pharmacy. So you're not going to be going down to your local CVS or Walgreens or Hannaford's to pick this up. A compounding pharmacy is a specialty pharmacy that has a specific license to manufacture medication. There's a handful of those in Maine. Most of them do support these kinds of prescriptions. You will either yourself, if you're still in good enough condition, or an agent that you designate can then go pick that up. But again, it's recommended you keep it there at the pharmacy. There's two reasons for that. The first is you're not paying for it until it's dispensed. So, let's say you have a pretty good quality of life at that moment, even though you've got a 6-month prognosis, you're living out your bucket list, you're enjoying time with your family, and you're not really feeling like you need it. You just leave that prescription there. And as you start winding down and you get to that place where you're thinking, you know what, I need to be picking a day, that's when you want to be thinking about when to get that prescription into your home. The other thing is it's lethal. It's a lethal prescription. You don't want it in your home if you have a lot of people coming and going. If you live in an area where there's a likelihood somebody could break in, that is not a prescription that you want in anybody else's hands. So that's why it's recommended you leave it at the pharmacy. Your physician will also prescribe anti-nausea medication, and a medication that causes your digestive system to move along pretty quickly. Those medications would be taken about an hour before you ingest the compound, and that's to keep you from vomiting, and also to optimize the condition of your digestive system to absorb that medication. So the goal of the medication is to put you to sleep quickly and then to ultimately stop your heart. The goal is within 2 hours, which generally speaking happens. There are some outliers. But for the most part, what I've witnessed, patients will go to sleep within 3 to 5 minutes. They go very quickly into a very deep sleep. And then the fastest death I witnessed was 7 minutes. The longest one I witnessed was 6 hours. What can affect that is several things. If you happen to be a younger person and a very healthy person before you got sick, so you have a strong heart, you have a healthy body, it might actually take your body longer to shut down with this medication. If you have a disease that affects your digestive system or affects the rate of absorption in your digestive system, it could also take you longer. The individual I was with that took 6 hours had been on an Ensure diet for about 18 months. And as you get towards the end of your life with a kind of wasting disease like the one that they had, it causes an atrophy in your digestive system, meaning there's not really all those little cilia inside of your intestines that absorb. There's not as many of those, and so medications absorb slower. The other thing that could happen, let's say that you were already taking a lot of pain medication, like morphine, your body might be accustomed to that, so that could take longer. And we had a situation here in Maine where a younger man decided to have a living funeral for himself. He invited all his family and friends, and they had a great party. He had a wonderful time, and he got absolutely drunk. He got so drunk, his body was very busy processing alcohol, and his death took a long time because his body had to wait to get done with the alcohol before it could manage the medication. So there's all your physician will talk to you about all of these things that could possibly happen, and then you would want to take the steps that you could take to make sure that your digestive system is clear and that it's you're ready to go when you take that medication. So if everything went like clockwork, and we know that it never does, but if it did, on day one, you're making the first formal request because you've got the terminal diagnosis, 6-month prognosis, and capable of making your own healthcare decisions. Day 15, you're making your second formal verbal request and handing in your written request to the physician. By day 17, if everything is in order, the physician is writing that prescription. And then the pharmacy would turn that around and you would be able to pick up that prescription probably within a day or two, depending on when they receive the prescription. When we first started here in Maine, it was taking about 5 business days to get a prescription out of the pharmacy. First of all, this was a very new process for them, and they were individually ordering the components for the medication when they got the prescription. Now it's a little bit more common, and they have that medication ready to go. So they can generally, if they're not getting it late on a Friday afternoon, they can generally turn that around within a 24 to 48 hour period. So I want to talk briefly about red flag deal breakers. These are things physicians look for that might tell them an individual should not qualify for medical aid in dying. The first is a significant mental illness that distorts the patient's decision-making capacity. So this doesn't mean if, let's say you have a history of clinical depression or, even bipolar disorder or anything like that, if it is not a significant illness that distorts your decision-making capacity, you can still qualify. Physicians would be much more careful, of course, and want to make sure that that you are exercising sound decision-making capacity. But that would be a red flag that they would be concerned about. In the absence of a clearly terminal disease or you're not likely to die within a 6-month prognosis, that's also a red flag. So what that could look like is, let's say, you're diagnosed with lung cancer. They're saying you have 2 to 5 years based on your scans, based on your blood work, based on what they can see, based on their best medical guess and their experience. You would not be able to qualify at that time. You can certainly have conversations with the physician. You can determine the treatment options that you want, and then they would have to follow your care to make sure, and you would also have to follow your care to make sure that when you get to that 6-month place, that you then can begin the process to qualify. If you have the possible presence of an easily reversible illness with non-toxic treatments, where there are confusing or difficult symptoms that could, with a referral, be identified as non-terminal and treatable, the physician would give you that referral to make sure that there's some certainty around your healthcare condition. This actually came out of a case in California that Dr. Shavelson had referred to him. He received a patient who had a terminal diagnosis, who was interested in qualifying for medical aid in dying. And on examining the patient, interviewing the patient, and reviewing the patient's records, felt like that patient really hadn't gotten the care they needed. So he referred the patient away. That patient actually did get the care they needed, and they recovered to a fairly high quality of life. So physicians don't make these decisions lightly. And it really is their responsibility and their moral obligation as a practitioner to make sure that the people who should qualify can, and the people who should not qualify don't. And then, of course, if the patient can't self-administer, then then the deal is broken. They cannot continue to qualify because the law requires the physical strength to self-administer. So I'm going to wrap up with a short video, and then I'd love to open this up for discussion and any questions you guys have. This is the story of Erik Carlson. He was a man who lived in Edgecombe, Maine. When our bill was going through the legislature for the third time, Erik was following it very closely because he was being treated with a glioblastoma brain tumor. He reached out to News Center Maine to share his story, which they did a remarkable job with. And he asked his family at that time to make sure that his story continued to be shared with people. So I am truly honored that we have Erik's story in his own voice, and that he was willing to make his story public so that people could really get a good understanding of what it was like for him to be able to have this option. So when I hit this play button, if somebody in the classroom there can just wave at me that you guys hear it okay, that would be great.
What would you do if you knew you were going to die in a week? Maybe that question makes you uncomfortable.
It does most of us. Our society has a real phobia around talking about death, in planning for it, in accepting it. Maine has had a death with dignity or medically aided dying law for a little more than a year now. But people in the medical community here who have elected to participate, who believe in offering terminal patients the option to end their suffering when they are ready, are reticent to talk about it. Fortunately, one patient was not. Erik Carlson contacted me last spring when the law was being debated. He was staring down a terminal illness with an awful end. He wasn't sure he would choose this option, but he wanted the choice. And eventually, he seized it. We caught up with him and his loved ones in Edgecombe last month with his self-imposed countdown ticking. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I feel pretty good now.
For Erik Carlson, the last 19 months have been a terrifying ride, one that started with numbness in his arm.
And they sent me for an MRI to see if just that, if I pinched a nerve in my neck, and it came back that's like just a strawberry-sized brain tumor, just right here.
It was a stage 4 glioblastoma. These tumors have tentacles that worm their way through the brain. Surgery will never get all of them.
It just came just out of nowhere that fast, which was crazy.
A devastating diagnosis for a rugged outdoorsman who jumped into wildfires out west, then ran a forestry business here for the last 30 years. Surgery, chemo, radiation, physical therapy. It was exhausting. But by summer, Erik felt better, knowing he was terminal, though not fully accepting it.
The only thing you can do is just live your life.
And he did. He took his daughters to visit relatives in Sweden.
It was no longer, oh, this would be such a fun thing to do. I hope we get to do that. It was, we're doing this.
Erik took his partner Stephanie to the Caribbean, his best buds on hunting trips, and taught his nephew how to fish. He danced and embraced the things and people he loved.
I was 100% sure in my mind, like I was the anomaly.
But cancer had other plans. This past summer, Erik started having seizures. He lost his balance, some cognitive function, and his driver's license. Another tumor had formed. More surgery, treatment, hospitalization. As Erik puts it, he was back on the hamster wheel.
You're just back in this, like, this crummy fair ride that you can't get off of.
But this time around was different. Erik was in tremendous pain. Reality closed in. The final decline had begun.
There's really no happy ending with it.
Aware of Maine's Death with Dignity law, Erik, with Stephanie by his side, broached the subject with his doctors.
I was a little bit worried when we first called that we were going to have to try to sell this. Like they were interviewing us whether they were going to give us our mortgage or not.
Nothing could have been further from the truth. He says his doctors made it clear they were supportive of whatever choice he made around how and when he wanted to die. No longer able to work in the woods, to hunt, to dance, Eric felt he was losing the things that made him him.
I don't want just days. I want to be me and do the things I want to do and be able to do. So it was clear to me then that that train was leaving the station pretty quickly.
He debated it for some time. Then one night, his decision became crystal clear. It was time to stop the hamster wheel for him and for his family.
I've had a harder time picking out which hot fudge sundae to get, like it was so clear, like, this is it.
He put in his formal request, got a second opinion confirming he had 6 months or less, saw a psychologist who declared him of sound mind, completed 2 waiting periods, and then, as his decline got worse, he set a date. 8 days after this interview.
I know that it's the right decision for him. He hasn't wavered.
There's just an absolute peacefulness to it where, all my affairs are in order, everything's done, and now you can plan for the positive things.
I'm never going to really lose who he is. And all of my memories of him will be exactly who he is.
And we all just come together and we joke around and we make sure, everything is the same as it always has been.
So what do you do with your last 8 days?
We're just going with the flow so far.
His best friend helped Eric get back in his beloved skidder for one last ride, the fun kind. This was Eric's last day. Surrounded by family, he took his prescription and drifted off, one day after celebrating his 50th birthday. Eric was determined to share his story so that others know about this option. Opponents of the law were concerned that there would be this mad rush by terminal patients to take advantage of it. It appears that has not happened. One person used death with dignity in 2019. The state, by law, cannot release statistics on this year until March of next year. But Valerie Lovelace, who runs Maine Death with Dignity, knows of only 4 cases this entire year. Her organization helps patients find doctors who participate, and she says while there are some issues with access in places, overall implementation of the law has gone smoothly. And the law has gotten a lot of support, she says, from the medical community. Still, it's not something those doctors, even Eric's doctors, are eager to talk about. Eric had given all of his doctors permission to speak with me. After he died, they all bailed. Lovelace says she's not surprised.
I mean, I try to stand in those shoes and think of what it might be like to suddenly be publicly identified as the go-to doctor if you want to die when you're terminally ill, and how that might affect your practice or how it might affect the way your colleagues look at you, or, so I sort of get that. It's difficult.
One other note, Eric and his family sing the praises of the amazing hospice workers who worked with Eric's doctors and were a tremendous source of support. We've got a lot more information on Death with Dignity on our website.
So with that, I would love to open things up for questions. I know I've thrown an awful lot of information at you. But hopefully you guys will have some questions or comments, so this is where I stop talking and you all start talking.
Okay. If anyone wants to either unmute themselves, I believe you can at this point. Anyone in the room have a question? We have a question here in the room, Valerie.
Okay.
I don't know if she'll be able to hear me, so you'll have to repeat it probably. My question is, it looks like most of these cases occur within the home. What, if any, experience is there within the hospital or in nursing facilities, or actually also residential hospice?
That's a great question. Currently in Maine, as far as I know, hospitals and hospices don't permit the patient to take their medication on the premises. That may change. That's very typical for a fairly new state like us. Other states like Oregon, Washington, they have hospice medical directors who prescribe, and folks can take it in the facilities, but we're not quite there yet. Next question. I think there was one, somebody in their home might have had one.
Oh, Teresa, let me see if I can, hold on. I'm trying there, dear, hold on.
Does she have?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. It seems complicated. Between the law and the government and all of that stuff, it seems complicated. But it's not. I think if you really need it and you want it, then you should do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it should be a complicated process in that it should be a process whereby a person who needs it can access it, but a person who shouldn't access it can't. But yeah, it is a complicated process, and even with the waiting periods, it really takes an average of about 50 to 60 days to qualify, because you have to wait for appointments and get
Right.
referrals and all of that stuff.
It kind of reminds me, and I don't know, 30 years or so ago, Gracia and I were trying to have artificial insemination, and we went to a meeting about it with the attorneys. And we went through that whole meeting and never really talked about how you do that. We talked more about what was legal and what wasn't legal and how to do all of that. So it kind of reminds me of that. It sort of starts that way and ends that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is definitely government oversight to make sure the process happens appropriately. But this really is, this is something a patient would initiate with their own physician. And if their physician doesn't practice, they would ask for a referral to a palliative care doc who does practice. And then it really is a patient and physician process. It's just there's, that framework that they have to operate within.
Yep. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question, Valerie, about the timing of the first conversation with your physician where you express your interest and your desire to have help with this process. Say your physician disagrees with your prognosis. So say your physician believes, I'm sorry, we think you actually have a year, Kate. So is the first request still logged in at the date you requested it? Do you see what I'm saying? Or does that have to?
Yeah, I understand your question. It would not be logged as your first formal request. Because again, you have to have that 6-month prognosis. So any physician who's worth their weight will tell you that prognostication is not a fine science. It is an art. And it's based on their years of experience, their, ability to interpret your test results and so forth. But they can get pretty close. The reason we have that 6-month prognosis is that's kind of the medical framework we have to work within for end of life law because of the Medicare requirements. So when you become eligible for hospice, so to speak, it's because you are terminally ill and you have an approximate 6-month time frame till the end of your death. So that's the medical model we had to operate within for these laws.
My second question is regarding Alzheimer's dementia and other forms of dementia. Is there a state that has a good model yet for handling those cases in terms of legislation?
Not in the United States. Unfortunately, that is still, I guess one of the things that is being talked about a lot right now in the United States is voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, that some people want to choose that. And if they get a dementia diagnosis and they want to be medically supported through that, which they would need, right? By the time you're 2 or 3 days into that, without food or water, you would end up becoming pretty weak and needing a lot of support. Even then, that's controversial here in the United States. I just came back from the International Conference on End of Life Law and Ethics. It was here in the United States this year, and one of the big topics was dementia and voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, and how do you support that? So believe me, this is a global conversation that's happening with dementia and the lack of care and the lack of options for people with dementia. I would say between the Netherlands and Canada, they probably have the most progressive approach to it. It looks like Quebec right now is even going to be trialing the ability of a dementia patient to pre-elect medical aid in dying. They would be able to assess with an official assessor what quality of life should look like for them, and at what point they don't want to live any longer. And then that would go in their record, and whoever their agent is would keep an eye on those things. And let's say it's, when I no longer recognize my family, I want medical aid in dying. Once you don't recognize your family anymore, your agent would be able to enact that for you. That's pretty progressive. It's getting a lot of pushback in Canada. I think and we did a comparison at this conference of all of the laws across the world. I think Canada's is by far the most brilliantly done. It's been very slow to implement because, frankly, the Parliament doesn't want to as much as the courts want them to. But I know the conversations are being had here in the United States. I just think we're really behind the 8 ball on that. There is a bill that's been proposed in California that might open that access a little bit more, but the bill hasn't even been scheduled for a hearing yet, and I don't know if it'll get one this session.
Thank you.
You bet.
Anyone else in Zoom land?
Hi, it's Joanne.
Joanne, okay, and then George. Oh, hold on.
You just muted yourself.
Hold on, Joanne. What happened?
All right.
Here we go.
There you go.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
Is there any activity going on in the United States about legalizing intravenous?
There is not. Again, that's a big topic of discussion. I think in my lifetime we may get to see that. A patient could still self-administer if a physician placed a needle, with a petcock or whatever, and then the patient could open that valve and receive the medication. As right now, the American Medical Association still has a position of opposition, even though there are other medical organizations that support aid in dying, like the American Academy on Hospice and Palliative Medicine, for example. I think they have what they call a studied neutral position, meaning they support a patient's or a physician's right to practice if that's what they choose to do. But yeah, it's hard to say. It's not been attempted yet. And one of the things we talked about at the conference, it was pretty interesting. There was a panel discussion that had representatives from all of the countries, and they were talking about how what appears to happen when a particular state passes a law, that seems to be the spaghetti that sticks to the wall. And so, like here in the United States, every one of our laws is based on the Oregon model, which is to take the medication by ingestion on your own. And so if we do get to the ability to use an IV, I think it's going to take a huge advocacy push to sort of break through that spaghetti on the wall barrier. But I love to hope that we will get there.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, George.
Hi, this is kind of a very detailed medication question, but tell me exactly what the medication is. Like, what's the form?
Yep, sure. So it used to be barbiturates. Back in the day, they were using pentobarbital. Around 2016 to 2017, that began to get very scarce in the supply chain. There was a single provider for it. The cost was rising and rising. By the time California passed their law, I think it was $8,000 to get that medication, which is crazy. So physicians in Oregon, Washington, California, and I believe Colorado came together with some anesthesiologists and pharmacists and said, okay, we have to come up with a formula that will do the same thing that this medication is doing, that's not going to cost an arm and 3 legs. So there are 5 components in it now. This medication has gone through probably 8 different iterations as they learn how it acts with a patient. So it has diazepam, digoxin, amitriptyline, morphine, and phenobarbital in it. So there's 3 sedatives and 2 medications that have an action on the heart, with the goal, of course, of putting the patient to sleep and stopping their heart in exactly that order, and being 100% effective. So you could go to the American Clinicians Academy on Medical Aid in Dying website and look at the pharmacology. They've got the actual what's in it quantity-wise, and see that it's pretty lethal. It's dispensed in powder form from the pharmacist in a glass bottle. It's generally mixed with either water or apple juice, about 2 ounces. And once that medication goes into suspension, it will the patient then drinks it.
Okay.
So it ends up being about 2.5 to 3 ounces.
So the only thing the patient has to be able to do is to take the glass with the powder dissolved, put it to his or her lips and swallow. Is that
Right?
okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Or if they're using a feeding tube to push the plunger, they
Okay.
can have help putting the medication into the feeding tube in the syringe. They can have help preparing the medication, but they have to take it.
So they can't have help holding the bottom of the glass either. Like if I'm having trouble, I have tremors, can
They,
someone then be,
yes, you can be supported by a family member. Let's say you have Parkinson's, and
okay,
if you don't have some help stabilizing that, you're likely to spill it across the room.
okay.
As long as you are the one bringing it to your mouth and you are the one, it's very obvious that you are taking the medication, you can have some help like that.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
you bet.
The two physician thing, no?
Well, why don't you ask?
Another question?
Yes, you met, at some point you mentioned that there 2 physicians had to be involved in the process.
Right.
Would you clarify that for me, please?
Sure. So that it could be your primary care physician and your oncologist, as an example. It could be your palliative care doc and your heart specialist, as long as it's 2 physicians who are familiar with your healthcare.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You bet. Okay, is there another question there in the classroom? And Joanne, looks like you're going to have another question.
Yeah. So in some very, extremely rural areas, there's not much of a choice for medical care. And so it has to be 2 physicians that are familiar with your care. That can be one who's really familiar and the other one who makes the other one familiar.
Exactly.
Correct? With the information.
Yep.
Okay, my another question I have is about the money. Has anyone calculated how much money it would cost between, what do you have to spend? I mean, because you can't use Medicare for anything.
Right. I couldn't tell you what it costs to get a consult or anything. The medication here in Maine is $375.
Okay, so it's the medication, it's the cost of all the consults. And what if you have a digestive system that isn't cooperating and you have to have a feeding tube put in? You pay the cost of that too?
Well, the Medicare would cover the cost of a feeding tube if you need a feeding tube. That's not specific.
But if you only needed the feeding tube for the bed.
Yeah, that would be a pretty rare situation. If you need a feeding
Right, yeah,
tube,
they probably
you need a
needed it for
feeding
something
tube.
else. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I can't answer those specific cost questions though, other than the medication. The other thing that we do have available in Maine is if you are a Maine Care patient. So Maine Care typically spends, $1 of state money against $1 of federal money. But if you're qualified for Maine Care, meaning you're a low-income person, you can contact Maine Care and ask for a waiver, and they will pay for the cost of the medication without using federal dollars. Because we just don't believe that a person's economic status should prevent them from having this option at the end of their life. If you don't qualify for Maine Care and you still just don't have the out-of-pocket funds, there are private funds available that will help support that, but you've got a couple more hoops to jump through. But we have the lowest cost in the country. Most states are over $700. When this initially went into effect, we had a pharmacy come online right away that decided they didn't want to charge a retail markup. So you're pretty much getting the medication at the pharmacy's cost.
Yeah, great.
Which makes us pretty lucky. Still though, $375 is unreachable for some folks.
I'm going to take one more question here in the room, Valerie, and then I'm going to urge people to follow up with you. Your website is very user-friendly, and I know that you can type in a question in a beautiful big text box that will go to Valerie, and I know she will follow up. Quick question. Yes, Karen here in the room.
I have a question. Does a healthcare professional have to be at the bedside when this happens?
They do not have to be. This is, just like you wouldn't have to have somebody watch you take your antibiotics, you don't have to have somebody watch you take this medication. It is recommended if your physician is willing to be there. That's many people find that comforting. And we do have a lot of physicians in Maine who do that. We also have a volunteer service of trained volunteers who will come and support your family if your physician can't be there. Help mix the medications, all of that, because it's a lot for a family to manage, and it's nice for the family to just be able to be the family that day.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you very, very much, Valerie. I want to thank everybody who attended tonight. This talk was inspired by, I said I would say this without crying. This talk was inspired by my mother-in-law, Barbara Cutco, who has suffered from Alzheimer's type dementia and was talked all her adult life about wanting to be in control of her own death. And as long as I knew her, she was a proponent to things like the Hemlock Society and Death with Dignity. She wrote a beautiful document that I consulted last week as Barbara was fading in memory unit. She wrote a beautiful document that unfortunately never had any legal strength to it, but it was her decision and the encouragement that she was giving to her medical team and her family to assist in her dying if she lost pleasure in life. And Barbara Cutco's pleasure in life was quantified in 5 different things, but I only remember 3. I remember that she wanted to know her family members. She wanted to know where she was, and she wanted to play a good game of Scrabble. Oh, that's awesome. So she died on Sunday night in a very respectful, naturally occurring way, and we are blessed by that passing. So, in the spirit of Barbara Cutco, thank you very, very much for coming, and follow up with Valerie if any of you have questions, and go and fill out that survey. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. And our website is maindeathwithdignity.org. Don't forget the main part.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Yeah.